Yeah, so documentation, it's a favorite topic of mine. Just we'll do a little recap from episode 2 and 3 because they both kind of led up to this. Um, but just really in the past, how we've talked about where do you get started in building a system from scratch? What are considerations? How do you get going? That's a lot of the tangible goods that teams use. But then today, yes, we are going to focus on documentation best practices. Documentation, it's an unsung hero, and it's really an integral part of a successful design system. So we're going to talk today a little bit about some best practices, where your documentation should live. We're also going to share a couple of community examples that really reflect really well just some best practices. Some of them may even be your companies, who knows? But we will share a little bit just as great examples for you to go out and check out and see what some great documentation can look like. And then, as always, we will answer questions at the end. They can be documentation related questions, or it can be design systems in general. Jacob, I know you're not shy. I'm not shy. We're willing to take any design systems related questions if you do have them.
Absolutely. Ask whatever you want there. We'll try and get to each of those questions. It's really meant to be an open forum for you to just ask us. Let us give us your opinion or our opinion on things and really jump into every aspect of design systems. That's what Building Blocks is about. But in the meantime, let's jump into some cool documentation things. So the first thing that I really want to talk through here is that when it comes to documentation, you really have to decide where it should live and the level of investment that you want for each piece of documentation that you have. And there's definitely different levels that are there. We're going to talk through each of these levels, but the important thing first to understand is what the right level is for your particular situation. And that changes every time. Really, this is the graph that I use to really decide where you should land. One of the main things that you really have to understand first and foremost is the number of customers that you are addressing with this documentation. Now, what I say when I say number of customers is not like how many customers does your company have, but how many customers does your design system have? And if you're talking about, only a couple different designers that are internally for your company, don't put a lot of time invested into this documentation and build out some fully custom site, even though I'm sure it will be beautiful. But it won't address the needs of that core group that are there. So give the right level of investment for the audience that you need. So at the very, very base level, at the lowest level, what we're really looking at is actually just documentation inside of Figma files themselves. Beyond that, though, that next kind of evolution, next step that's there that we see a lot of times for companies is they start moving into an actual online CMS. And the reason why this is really beneficial, we'll jump into later, but one of the major things is just that it's in the public space and it's something that can be indexed by a search engine. You start getting some external consumers of it, et cetera, et cetera. And lastly, at the top of that time invested that's there, you have that fully custom solution. And this is where some docs really shine. And we'll jump through a couple of cool examples of these, especially ones that we really love a little bit later. But first, I'm going to jump through the intricacies of each of these levels that are there. So let's talk first and foremost about docs inside of a Figma file. The easiest thing that you can do here, especially when you're just getting started, or what we would do as, we're at this point right now with our Twigma kind of design library, is we would actually add these docs inside of the file itself that has these components. And so these are just inline docs that we have right next to where the components are. It's super easy to set up because you can add these docs as you're actually creating each of these components. And it's a great starting point. It's especially great when you're still less than 50 users for your actual system itself. The other thing that I should mention here, though, is because we are adding things into the library doc itself, it can bloat that library file a little bit. So be conscious of that. It's still worth doing, especially if you're just starting out. But as your design system grows and you add more rich components, consider separating it out into potentially an actual dedicated docs file. So this is the level 2 evolution of having your docs inside of Figma itself. And by having it in a separate file, not only is it easier to organize because you're not managing the actual master components and like various instances of them, it also means you're going to start seeing smaller library files as well. They're going to be a little bit less bloated because they won't have the examples that are there. Another nice thing is that there's going to be a dedicated link for each of these pages that are here that you can actually, publish out, publish in like your GitHub repos so that your engineers know where these things live, or even add them in the component descriptions themselves. There's actually another part in here that I really like about having this out in a separate file. And it's another reason why, in addition to having that like fully custom site down the road, you may still want to actually have this in there as well. And the reason why is it acts as a great test bed for your published components. Because generally speaking, any sort of documentation is going to represent all of the examples of how that component should be used, which means that if we have a separate file, it's going to be consuming these instances, and we can use that to test receiving updates for our design system to ensure that nothing breaks. All right, with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Chad now, who's going to drop us through some actual examples of both the inline doc examples as well as a dedicated docs file. Chad?
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. And, as we see on the slides here, right, they can be very similar. And a great point, I just want to reiterate what Jacob was saying is it's very easy as you're creating your components to just start documenting right there in the file. Like it is a great starting point. That said, you might not even start it in your Figma file. You might start writing your docs. You might just use like a Google Sheet or like even your like notes app on your computer. Like there's no wrong place to start writing documentation. But let's take a look at what that can be if we jump into our component library here. So we can see that we have our component set for that button example. And we've evolved this from the previous building blocks where we started to create variants. We also started to apply component properties to them. So we now see that we have a nice smaller component set that generates all of these different instances just from our one small component set here. Now, here we have the examples in the library, and this is great because I do get a little bit of the ability to test changes right in the file itself. So I may change this button to see what it looks like with an 8-pixel rounded border. And it's instantly reflected here. So it's awesome because you can kind of have a little test bed in the file, but you don't get that full test like you would in an external file from publishing, seeing what accepting updates do. So that can be an advantage to do it in a different file. Now, the other thing we can do by having the documentation right in the file is what happens when folks are using these components in their files. We can set up, just as a refresher to the last episode, it's helpful to put in information for the button description, as well as a link to your documentation when you're creating the component. So if I were to, let me just take this component here. I'm just going to create a brand new design file here. And let's say I'm using that button in my file here. I can see that description. I get a little bit of introduction to it. Now I could go into the inspect tab and I could click that link to go right to the documentation. An advantage of doing your documentation in the library file is you don't have to just go to that inspect tab. You could always just click and go right to the main component in the library. And you're right there. You have all of the documentation right alongside the component set. So that can be one advantage of creating documentation right in the library itself. Now, if we take that a little further, we might say, hey, I want to have a dedicated documentation project that contains, maybe it's, we're calling this Leafy. Maybe we have our Leafy docs, and we might have documentation for a different theme in there. We may have separate mobile documentation, but it can all live within this documentation project. What's nice here is we'll just use the button here. I'm going to copy this link, and in the components here, when I go to the component set, if I were to include this link, now if I publish that change, and I'm just going to also take this here, we will review that update. So now I can still get right back to the component set by hitting go to main component, but I have a little bit different where, hey, if I'm collaborating with my developers, or I have PM stakeholders in here, I have copy teams coming in, they can also quickly, from that inspect view that they would have as viewers or as designers, we can go to it and we can click that link to view the documentation in Figma and bring us directly into that documentation file. Now, the last thing I'll say on documenting, if you are going to do it in Figma, is yes, it's great to have this test bed in a separate file, because here we can see I can test that update, and now I would see any of the updates. It's just the documentation link right here. But we could create our documentation to house everything. So we could have one documentation file that has all of our foundational shared styles, any patterns we may have in place, all of the components. We could also, by having a separate file, we could add even more into our documentation. We could start bringing in some screenshots and some other pieces that we're going to talk about in just a little bit as far as best practices on what to include. But again, a consideration you'll want to weigh is, it is still browser based. So are we going to potentially bloat a documentation file? Maybe we want to break it up even further. Maybe we want to have documentation purely for our components and information for folks getting started on using components. Maybe we even want to break it up further. Maybe we just want a documentation project and we have an individual file for each component, and we can guide folks just to the documentation for that individual component. So there are lots and lots of possibilities that you can do just by creating your documentation in Figma right alongside with your library assets. Now, of course, there's a lot more you can do even outside of Figma. So I'm going to hand it back to Jacob here, and we're going to take a look at some other possibilities.
Absolutely. And what Chad was mentioning is that there's a bunch of other opportunities that we have potentially outside of Figma as well. One thing that we see a lot of people aligning on as their second step in their evolution of their documentation is to use a CMS. And we did a little bit of research here around why users actually rely on CMSs for docs. And so these are some of the main themes that came out, as well as a few things that I want to touch upon in particular. But one that the main thing that people actually use these things for is just to have it be in an accessible location where it's in an actual platform that is consumable by devs, by PMs, by disciplines that aren't necessarily design, and people who aren't necessarily as familiar with Figma. And that's totally okay to target and make sure that those audiences are receptive to these docs as well. The other thing that we see as a major kind of boon for these CMSs is a lot of times you can have code examples in there and make them a little bit more developer friendly. So it allows you to really appeal to that wider audience that's there. And it's also pretty easy to get started with this as well. And because it's in that location where it is publishable online, one of the nice things is it can also be indexed by search engines, which starts actually promoting your design system outside of your company as well, which can be really useful when you're actually starting to make a name for your brand and your design itself. The other reason that we see people really jumping into CMSs is there's a ton of tooling that's out there that really heavily supports those use cases. And so this is just a poll that we did among a lot of our customers around which documentation tools are they using, what are the popular things that are out there. And one of the things we really see is a really heavy reliance on Storybook, which I've used in the past. I love having Storybook out there for those code examples. And it's such a rich way to really interact with both the code side of things while having it next to the actual design assets as well. Another one that we interestingly see as like one of our top kind of documentation tools is Confluence. So it doesn't have to be something that's dedicated towards documenting design systems. It can just be a general tool that's out there like Confluence, which really allows you to richly describe these interactions. Because that's what it really matters when it comes to documentation is how are these things interacting? What are the rules? What are the do's and do nots that are there? And you don't need something dedicated to the art of design system documentation to make that happen. That said, we do see things like Zero Height coming up as one of the other tools in there that's really popular, which is something that's going to be a little bit more tailored towards this actual use case as well. After CMSs, though, the thing that we want to highlight is that fully custom build that's there. These are really high effort, but they are worth it at scale. And one of the things I really want to emphasize that these really shine in is when you start having an ecosystem out there as well. What I mean by that is, let's say that you have plugins that you allow to be created, third-party developers that are actually consuming your designs and building things out with them. When that's happening, we see a huge, huge, huge need for much better documentation that's there. And even one of the ones that we're highlighting right here is Stripe as an example that I would show for really, really good documentation. It's not necessarily design documentation, but a lot of times documentation has a lot of best practices that are shared between design and dev. And I still think Stripe, even though it is developer documentation, is worth looking at if you're evaluating moving towards one of these kind of fully custom environments that are there. The other nice thing that we see is it really allows for that true unification of design and code docs that are there. And Atlassian.design does a really great job of doing this by merging them both together. The last one that I want to say is it also positions you as a leader in that design space as well, where people actually start to see you as like, oh man, they have really robust kind of polished opinions on these things. And, in the past, like when I was managing Atlassian, like we use this as a way to actually promote our design team a little bit more and allowed us to actually hire better talent because of it. So a ton of great reasons to dive into that fully custom solution that's there. But again, it is high effort, it is high investment. So evaluate what's right for you at the stage that you're at with your design system. All right, next we're going to switch it up a little bit. Chad's going to walk us through some best practices for that actual design system documentation that you have, and when you should do a couple cool tricks. Chad?
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. And there we go. I think one thing when we think about documentation and best practices on what should go into it, today we're in a really great place in this space where lots of folks have created great documentation, and there's been a lot of knowledge sharing out there throughout the community, lots of best practices that are within design system documentation sites. And it's not anything that's new. It's not anything that's even been in the last few years. When we really think about documentation, this goes all the way back to taking best practices from the graphic standards manuals back in the 60s and 70s. I always loved the old NASA design manual, or even taking things like we go into like the New York City, the Transit Authority. These are great examples of documentation that they explain how things should be used, where they should be used, when they should be used, why they should be used. These are all great examples from the past that have come forward as we get into digital design systems. So let's talk a little bit about some of those really important best practices to consider for including in your design system documentation. Now, as a great starting point, first and foremost, when we think about even going back to the very beginning of building blocks, and we talk about what goes into a design system. Your design system is not just your asset library, and it's not just your components. It also includes your governance model. It includes what your principles and your values are, any guidelines for the system, includes your contribution model, outlining some of that within your documentation. Right up front, it's very important to include your design principles and offering guidelines for the system. Great example, Salesforce, their Lightning design system. They have some great examples out there that outline their design principles. Now, as we think about where we might go into the docs as well, styles, of course, whether you're working with components or you may have even just your brand styles that go out there, there should still be some foundational style guidance that explains how do you use different type scales that you may have, how do you use your color ramps. If you've been with us in the previous building blocks, you'll know that we've built those color ramps from the ground up. Now we should explain why were they built, how are they intended to be used. Shopify's Polaris, they do a great job of breaking down, explaining their color rules and how they name their colors based upon where it's being used, what the intent is. So very, very important to include any of that foundational style guidance right within your docs. Moving beyond style, that's where we start to get into our components. And this is probably where we spend a lot and we see a lot of repeated effort in creating your documentation. So when we think about our values and our principles, that's kind of our core set and setting things up front. Our foundational styles, they are kind of global for everything. And then our components, that's where we could have 5 components in our system. We could have 50 components in our system. Now, these next few slides are some great best practices for breaking down the component specific documentation. One thing that I really, really like when I am reading docs is a breakdown of what the anatomy of a component is. Showing like every possible iteration, like it can get very crazy, but showing the anatomy of the core pieces of a component, it's in essence like planning out how you're going to build component properties into a component in your Figma file. You want to plan out, hey, what is that container going to do? What is the label? What are the icon rules for it? Just creating a quick snapshot where folks can very quickly see everything that exists within a component. As you can see, we've even done that in this particular example here, where it can be very simple. So very simple, or you can also go very in-depth. Of course, examples and variations. You want to be able to document and show folks what is possible within the system. What are the different uses and variations of a component that are available to them, either via the design components or via the code components. Here we have an alert from Segment's Evergreen design system, and just showing it can be very simple and just a little bit of guidance around what those examples are and any of the variations available. All right, now probably the biggest piece that if there's anything you're putting in your documentation, I highly, highly recommend investing that time in your usage guidelines. Calling out what the intent is for using that component and things that designers, when they are designing with it, or developers when they're building with it, they're going to be able to have in the back of their minds and know that, okay, here we have for action guidelines here for, this comes from the button piece in the Orbit design system from kiwi.com. Plan out the most important actions and then also show examples. These are really, really great way to show at a snapshot of, hey, here's a good example for this. And here, this is a lot of actions here. What are we expecting customers to do here? I don't know. So showing those do's and don'ts can be very, very helpful. Even if folks don't want to read through everything, just having that very quick visual can be very, very impactful. And then probably the other piece that I would say is very, very huge and important to put into your documentation. Call out any of the accessibility features or considerations that have been made within that component. Here in IBM's Carbon design system, I like that in their inputs, they have accessibility documentation for all of their components, but specifically in here, they also outline what happens with keyboard navigation. They show the order of how the tab orders are set up to go through the component. It's really huge. And it goes to a point where I like to say, just because you have accessibility features built into your components, it doesn't automatically mean that you're going to create an accessible experience. Documenting what's already included and then the intent for use of those components in the guidelines can really help folks as they are building experiences keep accessibility top of mind as they're using those components. And then, of course, another great thing, and this is when we start getting into, as Jacob was talking, maybe we are looking at a CMS solution here, or maybe we're looking at a storybook implementation or custom site implementation. When we think about our design system documentation as a whole, it's not just the design side of it. Obviously, there is the code side, the code and the design assets, they complement each other. So our documentation should do the same thing. We want to make sure that we have code examples within our documentation. And in some of the other solutions, if we get into CMSs or custom builds, we can actually have those live code rendering of the component. So you get the actual interaction. If you pair that with your design docs and your code examples, it gives you a little bit of testing as well, where you can see, are there variations between the design and code? And then ask those questions on, wait, is our code up to date or is our design up to date? It's a nice little check and balance right there. Jacob, I want to just pause, if you have any thoughts on that. I know that you and I have talked a lot about design and code and just like those checks. Any thoughts that you have on the code example side?
I mean, I think one of the nice things about having the code examples inside of your documentation as well is it allows you to actually spec out the way that the design component works to be as close as possible to that code as well. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we actually launched component props internally here, is we wanted the ability for you to actually create components that aligned as much as possible with the actual code representation of those. So if you're actually like adding in those code examples into your docs, that actually presents you an opportunity to see if the two actually align, and if not, how you can make them align more. So I actually like it just as an exercise and a forcing function to really make you think about whether or not you have alignment there or not.
Awesome. And, a great point that you bring up there is that alignment and, even thinking about component properties, right? That's an important piece to have in your documentation as well, for your developers to have that reference to any of the API information that's available. Here in GitHub's primer, we can see some of for their overlay, we can see what some of the props are for that. And this can also be helpful if you're, if we go back to our button component that we've shown, in deciding what props to apply, having that documented in the design system, it's great for the maintainers of libraries to be able to see, hey, here's the props we have in code. Which of these make sense for us to reflect in design as well? But again, yeah, it's bringing everything closer together, and we can name things the same way to start creating some of that shared vernacular. So all for it. And I think the important piece as well is that through all of this, it's also about knowing your audience, right? just reiterating that your docs aren't going to be just for designers or just for developers. There's also going to be other folks in your company as well. Like, you're going to have folks in marketing who are going to want to know about your design system and what exists. Your brand team is going to want to know. Sometimes your C-level execs may want to know what your design system does. And having this documentation and this nice robust documentation, Jacob talked a bit about this with, it really puts you out there as, hey, here's everything that we have in our design system. It's the collaboration between all different areas of the business coming together to solve these common problems in the design system, so we can then use our collective energy to solve the bigger problems of the experience. Awesome. And then the last thing I think definitely want to include in your documentation is how to contribute to the design system and how to get help. When folks are onboarding to a company and starting to use your assets, they might want to know, hey, how do I get help? Am I using this right? Or, hey, I found a bug, or, hey, I have this really like big use case that I don't think the system has accounted for. This kind of gets into your contribution model and what's that going to look like. Include at least some guidance in how people can get in touch with your design system team, things for considerations before contributing to your design system. And know that not everything will necessarily go into the design system. Some things, they may live off as an individual snowflake within a product team, and that's totally cool. So provide the guidance and give people the option for a way to be able to get in touch. All right. So before we switch over to Q&A, a couple of things. So we've grabbed some samples here from a few different documentation examples. Just lots of things that we've seen as best practices in our previous lives, as well as even we see throughout the community today. So a few things that bringing all of this together to actually show this in action. We've queued up a few documentation sites that these are publicly available sites, and they really do a great job encompassing a lot of these best practices and considerations for documentation. LS in design. Jacob, I'll let you talk about this one.
This was a fun one that we worked on when I was there, actually. And this was really Atlassian's attempt to unify design and code in one documentation site. So if you're looking for an example of how that's done, please check it out. Again, though, that is a fully custom representation of what you can do with a really robust kind of documentation site that's there.
Yeah, and just getting into those best practices as well, right? So examples, having code in there, having usage, accessibility information, like all of these best practices really brought together. A few others that we often hear from folks in the community are like, oh, definitely check out Shopify's Polaris. Lots of great examples. Even in the Figma community, at figma.com/community, Shopify makes some of their library examples available in the community. So if you even want to look at thoughts for component architecture or documentation in your Figma files for getting started, Shopify supplies that on the Figma community. So very, very cool to be able to just go jump out and take a look at that. We also talked a little bit about Carbon's design system, Carbon from IBM. Lots of great information here. One thing I love about Carbon's documentation is when you're diving in, we highlighted the accessibility before, but they actually dedicate sections to accessibility for different components. So if you are looking for great examples or even just considerations for accessibility in your components, this is a great place to read and learn. A few others, Adobe Spectrum, they do a great job in their documentation on talking about how to break down different patterns and how to have different components set up. So great examples on the pattern level documentation. I know we didn't get too much into patterns today. We talked a little bit more about components, but great documentation examples. Same thing, Orbit by Kiwi, we highlighted theirs. Lots of great things in theirs as well. Workday's Canvas system. Something really cool in Workdays is they outline a lot of their token use and, just beyond color, some of the different motion pieces of things, as well as getting into some of those patterns as well. So another great example with usage and deciding on when to use certain buttons. And of course, as Jacob mentioned, a really great one, Stripe Stocks. Just everything that's built into the documentation here. It gets into components. It gets into just general development guidance. It gets into how to get started, even just building an app from the very beginning. So great examples in here. And then finally, if you are looking for additional resources or even want to see examples available in the Figma community, you can also check out designsystems.com. There is a design system repo in here that will link to specific community files where you can actually see how some of these companies have set up mirrors of their libraries that they use every day and shared that out within the Figma community. So with that, before we jump into Q&A, Jacob, anything else that you would like to add on the documentation and examples that folks can find?
Chad, I think you covered most of it. I mean, the thing that I would definitely say, though, is check out those examples for sure. It's so helpful having that guiding North Star, and then you can really decide what is right for your documentation needs that you have, and you can use those examples as just a guideline. So yeah, do the research for sure. It really pays off in the end. Don't try and reinvent the wheel when all these things have been done before, for sure. But with that said, let's jump into some Q&A. There's some good questions that we've got here.
All right, awesome. So yeah, let's jump over and let's take a look. All right.
So first
Jacob,
question
I see your avatar here. Are you taking this one?
I'm taking this one. Yeah, I stamped our faces. I volunteered you for some as well. Congratulations.
All right.
But yeah, the first one that I want to jump into here is how would internationalization fit into documenting in Figma? Thank you, Darren, for this question. This is actually a really interesting one because, earlier we were talking about having all of your docs in a separate Figma file and how it can be useful having those components inside of there as instances because it helps that kind of update flow. One of the other things that I found previously as well, that in addition to really helping with that ability of testing those updates and publishing, it also can help out with testing that internationalization inside of that documentation itself. We actually built a custom plugin when I was over at Atlassian that it took all of the actual strings that were inside of instances in a selection, and it switched them out to different languages that we were supporting as well. And we used that inside of our documentation to show separate examples of how that element would actually display in English for the standard consumer that was there, in the longest possible translation that we had, and also in the shortest possible translation. I've also seen some people go so far as actually have translation maps in the component itself for common things like button actions that were there being documented in buttons themselves. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that internationalization in the docs itself. And if you are building out that custom solution, you can just have a language selector at the top and dynamically switch things out for sure.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's jump to this next one.
Awesome. So we're in the stage of go live and delivery of the system to the client and seem to always have unanswered questions around 1, the delivery methods and permissions, and 2, versioning on their end. Any recommendations? There's a bit more to understand behind this one, I think, before necessarily diving into this one. One thing I would recommend maybe for consideration if this is like an agency type handoff model, I mean, there's questions here like, are you sharing a Fig file? Are they working within your instance? Are you working within their instance? If sharing a Fig file and importing, are you using swap library to relink things? Are you using move component? If whoever had asked this question, if you are able to provide a little additional context, it may help. One thing I could say, where if you are looking for some questions around delivering permissions, check out figma.com/community. If you search for our designer advocate, Louis, disco_Lou, he has a treasure trove of resources there for considerations for files and for setup to help on some of the permission side of things. Yeah, I guess I would say on this one, whoever asked this, if you could provide a little more context, we can see if we can come back to this. Otherwise, feel free to tweet Jacob and I, and we can see if we can follow up with you on Twitter.
All right, this is one that I thought was interesting. I thought that we could both answer here, Chad. This person has a very rigid design system manager. They think that it's not time yet to let their product designers actually collaborate back to DS itself. At what point do they actually start building out that collaboration model that's there? This is something that at least I have always found tricky, especially because that collaboration model is, they're usually at odds for what the needs of the users are and for what the needs of the design system is. And so you often really want to find a balance there. That said, one of the things that I would really say is try and utilize some of the features that Figma has itself, where if designers do want to contribute back, suggest that they work in a branch on the main design system components file, and then from there they can submit that branch to actually be pulled into the master. That's usually the best way that we find that collaboration model to work. And I think that if your design system manager sees the effect of what this designer has actually done and the suggestions that they are making, then at that point, ideally what happens is the proof is in the pudding, and they kind of know what's going to happen, what's coming, and how this thing works itself. And then it may actually prove itself, and maybe more amenable to actually having that happen. Chad, any other recommendations that you would make?
Yeah, I think one thing I was kind of saying when we highlighted the importance of including contribution information, or who to reach out to within your docs. I said that sometimes the contribution, it may make sense to be adopted into the design system, and at other times, it may not make sense for the design system, and it is something that becomes a pattern that is like completely owned and lives within particular product team for their use case. I think part of this conversation as well is like, hey, maybe if there is something that should be adopted globally, like maybe multiple teams are using the same convention for things, it's a good case to make to the design system manager that, hey, we have 50% of our teams in the organization are utilizing this same pattern with slightly different. Maybe we should consolidate this to create it so it is consistent for everyone and included in the system. At the same time, you may have a use case that is very specific to your product or feature set, and it may seem like it's a great idea to include in the design system because it expands upon an existing component or pattern from the system, but it may not make sense to distribute it in the system if it is a standalone. Where I'm kind of getting to with this is that I think that it is that fine line, and having been in this, having been in the design system manager kind of balancing act before there for what contributions come in, what things don't, what stays rigid, what's flexible. You do need to make sure that there is that balance. And if you're on the call and you are a design system manager on the call, just remember it's about that balance. A system does need to have some degree of rigidness to it, but it shouldn't be so rigid that everything just bounces right off of it and it's only one way. There does need to be some fluidity in there. One thing that we always said with my previous team, and like I really believe, is that your design system, even with your contributions, it should be about empowerment over enforcement. Empower folks to be able to use that system, propose changes. It's what keeps your system growing and really becomes the reflection of the users of that system.
Cool. Let's jump to this next one here.
All right, awesome. How do you approach component iterations, archival, and updating instances with newest versions at scale? Awesome question, Jeremy. Jacob hinted a little bit at this, even in some of the contributions with using some of the branching method. One thing that we've seen teams really do is utilize the branching feature in the organization or enterprise tier for iterating on their components. One of the last things you really want to do is be updating the component in main, because some teams are going to come into your library file, use it as a sticker sheet, just copy and paste components out of it. They might be using a work in progress. So, that's not always the best experience. What we found, and I personally, Jacob, I wish we had branching when I was really doing this on the day-to-day. It would have made updates and iterations so much easier. But being able to use a branch, create those iterations, be able to see what that's going to look like, and then merge it in, have that review process as a part of it. That's a big piece that we're seeing teams do now. When it comes to archival and updating instances, it is a question that we get. I know, Jacob, you probably hear this question from folks in the community all the time, is, versioning components. I'm versioning the library, or do I version an individual component? I haven't said it yet today, but my favorite words as a designer, it depends. It depends. You may have your components all in a library and you just version that library as a whole. You might have components each as their own files, and each of those have their own version. You could have versions on the individual pages within a library file for each component as well. Those are just a few of the best practices that we've seen teams do. At the end of the day, it comes down to really what works best for you and for your team. Lots and lots of ideas out there. I'm going to also plug Louie's community files again. There's one that our whole designer advocate team worked on a few weeks back that's published on the community about organizing your design system. And even that can get into a little bit of how you might think about versioning things.
Totally. Yeah, I also like to just align with code sometimes, especially at a mature state, for whether or not you should do individual component versioning versus file versioning. All right, we've got about 5 minutes left for these next questions that are here. Chad, are you ready to do a speed run round of these to knock out the ones that are left?
Cool, let's do it.
Let's do it. When we got this one here, which is, when will we be able to add descriptions documentation to specific component properties themselves? We are looking at the ability to add richer descriptions to components, as well as the ability to look at different states that are there. I sadly can't make any promises for when this will happen, but it is something that we're aware of at the very least. One thing I'll do again is plug our actual Figma forum. The suggest an idea category as well is really useful for us to track and prioritize these things. All right, next question.
I know we're speedrunning it, but I want to say one thing for Howie here as well. While we can't do it for props, we can do it for individual variants though. So you still can drop in, you have your overall button component docs. You can add in additional descriptions and links for individual variants as well. So just want to show that on there. All right, how much time does minimal documentation usually take as an individual? This one, you can write documentation in 15 minutes, come back to it later, or you could block an entire day and go at it. Some components way better than others, and you might be able to write documentation for one component in an hour, and another one you might need to collaborate and write documentation over the course of a week. So it kind of just depends on where your headspace is at and where your focus is at right on that component.
All right, this one. When will there be native support for tables inside of Figma itself? This is a major pain point that we're aware of. I mean, Chad, I'm sure you went through the same thing over at GoDaddy. I experienced it over at Atlassian. Tables are hard to do in Figma today, and it's something that we're aware of. Right now, the best way to do it is to use like some crazy auto layout hacks that are there, and there's a bunch of examples in the community that actually allow that. I also have seen a few good plugins here that allow for generation of these. That said, it is something that we're at least aware of. We're not working on it right now, but please, 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 if you are interested in this, go into that Figma forum, suggest that idea that's there so we can prioritize it. All right, next question.
All right. On the Netflix Hawkins team, we've been experimenting with Figma embeds within Google Sites. Any tips or guidelines for using Figma embeds for documentation? Yeah, so I've actually seen this. A few of the examples that we had shared earlier, I've seen some even public sites use the embeds. I've used it in the past for doing the component anatomy. Like it's really, really cool to be able to just build that anatomy and do the Figma embed for that. And if you need to tweak that, it's very quick just to update it in your Figma file and it's reflected in your documentation. The name is escaping me off the top of my head, but I know that there is one of the documentation sites out there. And it can be, if you look at their actual site linked off of the designsystems.com, if you go to their community file in their actual site, they actually use Figma embeds even for all of their variants and for the examples, and they have it wired up with interactive components. So they are embedding the prototype in their documentation, and you get to see the hover effects, the press effects built in as interactive components.
Totally. I will add a small thing here as well, though, is be aware of performance when you do this, because when you are embedding, you're embedding that actual full Figma file experience that's there. So if you're trying to do embeds, try and limit it to one per page rather than doing like 100 examples of embeds that are there. You'll crash Chrome. It'll be a sad day. All right, let's jump into the next question that we have here. Designers would know everything about a button instance. So who does the documentation actually serve? I would actually disagree with this. I think that I find a lot of times people don't necessarily understand when to use certain actual buttons, when to use certain representations of states in those buttons. The classic example I would say is like, you have your brand button versus you have like a success button that's colored green, for instance, and the brand one is blue. And oftentimes, you'll see that people use those interchangeably and they'll not understand the reasoning behind using one or the other. Or they may use like a danger button because they're like, oh, red would be fun right here or something. I think you'd be surprised in how useful that documentation is just for enforcing consistency across the system, especially at scale.
Cool. And we'll take this one probably as the last one here. Can you explain more about what is valuable to document about components most commonly? Yeah, I think we'll have this in the replay as well on YouTube. Really everything that we covered in the best practices there, as well as just taking a look at some of the examples out there on designsystems.com. Just taking a look at some of those repos, they all capture really important things. If I leave you with any bullets, I'd say accessibility information, usage guidelines, and how to get help. Like those are probably three really, really important ones, because the how to get help is important to ask those other questions that maybe aren't as clear in the documentation. All right. So with that today, thank you so much for joining us. I started the presentation over at the beginning, so I'm just going to mouse scroll here. So again, you can check out designsystems.com there. If you do have additional questions, feel free to tag Jacob and I on Twitter. Vanessa has shared our Twitter handles there in the chat. But also, if you do have questions, help.figma.com, a great resource, forum.figma.com, share your product ideas with us so we can send those design system feature requests over to Jacob and be like, oh, can we do this? And then friends.figma.com, you can learn about our Friends of Figma groups all around the world, learn about our Friends of Figma Discord, and join the conversation. So with that, thank you so much. You can Check out our future live streams at figma.com/events. This session was recorded today, and we'll be posting it to the Figma Design YouTube channel in the coming weeks here. And if you do have suggestions or ideas you'd like to share with us, let us know, community@figma.com. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Chad. This was awesome to see. Thanks for walking us through some cool examples of what's good there. And thank you everyone for joining. So much fun doing these. We'll see you for the next one.